There was no plumbing. There was no electric. When my mother moved back from New Jersey, there was just a telephone and the paper they got every day. That's how we learned the news. There was no radio, there was nothing else. My grandpa got light electric in the house after we were there a couple of years in the dining room. That's all, but it was still better than a cool oil light. My mother made most of our clothes, and every year she'd order material from Sears Roebuck. She'd get black, was like a sateen, and she'd make us black bloomers, and that's what we wore to school, one pair all week long, and when we were younger. And I never had a bought dress until I went to high school.
I remember of driving from Mickelsburg, going from Mickelsburg to Blaine, I believe monthly, to get a little bag of potatoes, a bag of rice, a little bag of dried beans, I think maybe a pound of butter. People were starving, absolutely starving. There was no work. Of our neighbors kind of belittling people that didn't bake their own bread because they were too good to bake bread, too lazy, too whatever. And I think bread was maybe 6 or 7, maybe 8 cents a loaf. So we would maybe get one loaf a month, maybe.
Aunt Betsy would make, for the birthday party, she always had a tall dish that she made homemade butter. And she'd make a big thing of butter and take a screw and decorate it to make it look like a pineapple. You hated to cut it.
I've been interested in history since I was in grade school, and part of that interest came from my grandfather Klaus. His name was Charlie Klaus. He was born in 1888 in Henry's Valley, which is west of Landisburg. There was quite a crude, I guess, way of life at that time. They didn't have central heating or central air and all that, and they farmed and worked in the timber during the winter to make additional money to buy their needs at that time. The farmers there were sort of marginal. It was hilly land. It was not the best productive land. It wasn't like the main valley of Sherman's Valley where there was rich limestone soil. The soil was rather thin, and so farming, they had to have another kind of employment during the rest of the year to supplement farming. They used rails to take over to Newville so to be made into rail ties and things like that. They made spokes for wagon spokes, and they would take them to Newville because there was a spoke factory over there. So they were rough hewn and then taken over there to be refined. They raised their crops. They had their own chickens and other foodstuffs. As they had like a cold cellar that they stored their apples and things in, and the cabbages and all that. My great-grandfather even made shoes on the side that they made the pegs for, and the leather. He tanned his own leather. The ladies probably once a week, when it would go over the mountain and take their eggs, and they would usually travel together and have their baskets of eggs and take over and get whatever they might need. Things that they would need were like what they called coal oil, which was kerosene for their lamps. There were peddlers at that time. Peddlers came through the valley and sold threads and needles and things like that. When the Oak Extract Company left and other timbering was pretty much, the land was timbered over, so to speak, they sought other work and other places to live, And the Klauses moved in 1907 to Cumberland County. It wasn't an easy life, but they were hardworking and were able to save money. And eventually they moved to Cumberland County and bought another farm over there.
One day, it was after I'd come home from the Navajo Mission, and I was really needing money, and I was doing odd jobs mowing lawns with the push mower and that sort of thing for 50 cents or like that. And I went in the post office one day. It was just a small one, but there was a sign, help wanted. And I asked about it, and it said it paid $2.20 an hour. That was big money. And guaranteed 4 hours a week. So that $8.80, minus the taxes and whatever, Social Security, was enough to get me through. 7 years later, the lady who had been postmaster for over 40 years, just decided she was going to retire. And they come from Harrisburg and said, "Do you want this job?" I said, "No, I don't want to be penned up inside the rest of my life." But I come to my senses. I said, "I think I better take it." It was very interesting because you knew everybody, and of course you got blamed for everything too. And so I really appreciated all the youngie, especially coming and hanging around the post office. The school bus picked them up there, so they'd come inside the post office and really jammed it up, but to wait in the wintertime. And it was just great having them to talk to. The old people to hang around there too. You couldn't get anything done because they were always, that was your newspaper. One didn't know, somebody else did. But one joke that we had, if a stranger would come in, when they'd go out and people would start talking, wonder why are they here? What are they doing in New Buffalo? And that sort of thing. And it always ended up, well, they ain't from around here. They'd say about, well, they ain't from around here. And that got to be a joke. They ain't from around here.
You couldn't have found a more friendlier store proprietor. Shirley and Dawn Gordon and Logan, Shirley's father, were very down-to-earth people, very giving people. They had everything, like your vinegar came in barrels, your kerosene came in barrels, your pickles came in barrels. You got a big slab of cheese, that the wheel-type cheese. In today's age, you wouldn't have that out in the open. You would come in with your jug, your gallon jug or your jar, and there was a plug on it with a thing that you opened, it drained out. Yeah, it was a barrel for whomever needed it. Same way with the kerosene. It was a barrel, and if you needed a gallon of kerosene. Okay, and the pickles, you just helped yourself. Sorry. Dawn didn't have it on when you came in for an item. I'll get it for you on Tuesday. That was his motto. I'll get it for you on Tuesday. Tuesday was his day to go to Harrisburg and pick up items, groceries that he couldn't get locally. Of course, in the evening, the men, the farmers, the workers, that was their hangout. Women didn't visit there very often. In the evenings, their time was during the day. And when it left, it changed the whole situation totally. It just disappeared. Everything disappeared. People went to Newport, to Millerstown to get the groceries, and just wasn't the old-fashioned store place anymore.
Andersonburg at that time had a general store. Earl Fisher had the store, and Guy Adele had the garage. And before we became owners of a TV, we would go out there. They would loaf over at the store, the men, and they sent we children over to Guy Adele. In their kitchen, they had a TV, and we could sit in there and watch the TV.
Even our own children could never fathom that world that we grew up in, ever. We had no phone, no electric, and I tell my friends, I was really a poor kid. I didn't even own a cell phone back then. I worked all kind of jobs besides the farm and got 25 cents an hour, and usually all I could eat from some of the neighbors. It was farm work. And then when I got a little older in high school, I got 4, 5, 6 lawn jobs around town, so I mowed lawns. And then eventually I got a job on the sawmill. I was still in high school in the summertime, of course, for Dow Fusselman, and I got like $1 an hour, I believe. I thought I was like Mr. Trump. I was loaded, and worked 10 hours a day and run a 2-man chainsaw. Now, most people don't know what that is, but the one end of that chainsaw weighs, in my estimation today, somewhere around a ton. So, quite heavy. And so we would work an hour on the heavy end and then an hour on the light end. And at the end of 10 hours, I would ride my bike to, in the area of the Little Buffalo State Park, from Gloucester Hollow to Little Buffalo, and then work 10 hours and then ride home. Eat and go straight to bed. I was so tired. It was interesting. It kept me out of trouble.
So we knew what it was like going out and working in the garden. Like when it came time to plant the plants and so on, seed the seeds, we would go out and we would do that. And then also, I mean, there were 5 in my family plus my father and my mother, so we had to depend mostly back then on our gardens to help us, with with the food and situations.
Was in school, I'd come home and get a bite to eat. You come home, you're a little hungry, and you get a bite to eat. And you went to the barn. There was always, you either had to help milk, or you had to feed some animals, or mow the lawn. And I can remember going and playing football on a Saturday afternoon, and Sunday or Saturday evening when we come home from the football game, we had to go to work.
Most farmers, including my dad, usually started at 5 in the morning. Did the morning milking, and then you did the field work or whatever had to be done around the barn all day long, and then you milked again at 5 in the evening. It was usually every 12 hours you milked. And then if it was in the summer and there was other work to be done like haymaking or plowing or planting, you went out after supper. And you would ask the length of a farmer's week. It was 7 days.
On usually Wednesdays and Saturdays, we'd have to hook up the horse in the wagon, and we would go down to Hotel Rhinesmith and pick up their slop. And we took it home and fed it to the pigs, and also at Schaefer's restaurant. Life wasn't easy on the farm.
My great-grandfather worked in the tannery, and on Fridays, Mr. Rittman, who owned the tannery, lined all the tannery workers up outside the tannery building, and their pay was a silver dollar every Friday. So in the 1920s, my great-grandfather was making $4 a month.
The business got better, and as she was doing it, it kept growing. And I came home from the Merchant Marine, and there was a job there for me. I mean, we kept adding to the business, and she went from a hand-to-hand business to buying machinery. She saw machinery advertised in a magazine, I guess, and she sent for it, and we set up in the cellar of an old gas station.
When my brother and I became of well, 6 to 8 years of age, we then could carry milk, we could carry water to the pigs, to the chicken houses, gather the eggs and things. And we learned early on how to hoe and plant vegetables.
Work ethic is what I was taught growing up. When I worked at my 2 jobs away from the farm, I always stayed to help my dad on the farm when I could, but I had to work away when I started raising a family. And the 2 places that I worked for Pennsy Supply in Harrisburg as a payloader operator for 13, 15 years, and then I hauled U.S. mail for 25 years, tractor trailer. In both places, I always showed up for my job. I always did my job. And everybody said, you know, you're from Perry County. We can tell, you know, because you have some work ethic, yeah.
It was a holiday, and they were very busy here. And Dave called and asked my mother, he said, don't you have a teenage daughter? And she said, yes. And he said, well, I really need help at the hotel. Would she be willing to come down and help? So I came down and helped. And that day, I think I got the biggest tip I ever did, because I waited on a gentleman, and like then, the meals were like $7.95, and he left a $20 bill. And so Mr. Myers came in, and I told him it was a friend of his, and he said, well, I'll check with him. And later on, Mr. Myers came back and gave me the change. He said he wanted you to have this. He said you were a good little waitress. So that's how I got to work at the Towpath dining room. I loved working here. It was great, and the women, the cooks, they were fabulous, and everything here was homemade. And you didn't have ketchup bottles and mustard and all that on the tables. It was very prim and proper, but it was a wonderful place to work. And Mr. Myers was, he was very nice to work for. And while I was working here, Billy Cox was the bartender, and of course I was underage. I couldn't serve people, so whenever someone came in and wanted a drink, then I would go over and he'd come over and serve them. Billy Cox played for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and I believe he was the 3rd baseman. And we actually have a park where the kids play ball up at the end of 2nd Street, and it's in memory of him.
And we were really intensely listening to the World Series because we all loved Billy Cox, even if we didn't know him personally. And it was the 9th inning of the World Series. The game was tied. I think the bases were loaded, and there was 2 outs, and Billy Cox came out to bat, and I believe he was out. They'd lost the game because it came right down to it, and Billy Cox, and we thought, well, it was still great, but I know that we were all sort of disappointed, but we still loved our Billy Cox.
I answered the telephones. It was a catalog order store. And I answered the phones, and I had this call one day, and this guy told me he wanted a post hole. We don't sell post holes, and back then is when they were selling, or advertising, Sears sells everything. And he got really irate with me. He says, what do you mean you don't sell post holes? He said, that's false advertisement. I said, well, sir, we have post hole diggers. And I looked it up, and I told him what page. He said, no, I want a post hole. And here it was the boss's brother giving me a hard time. So at Christmas time, I took a sand bucket and put a hole in it and wrapped it up, and I gave it to him for Christmas. And his wife said he kept it in their garage for the longest time. But he's passed away now.
It was a little over half mile that we walked, and it was all dirt road. There were no. And we went no matter if there were no snow days. It was rain, snow, or whatever, we went to school. I remember in 2nd grade, we had to remember or learn the Gettysburg Address before we could go on to 3rd grade. My 1st grade was taught by Miss Zula Swords, and she was a heritage person. Anyhow, she taught 1st and 2nd grade, she was very strict. You knew when she said no, it was no. And once that sticks in my mind especially was we were up at spelling and I was to spell Wednesday. Well, I didn't get the N in Wednesday, and she made me stand in a place that was offset from the rest of the room. And I was back there, and she went on the warning and had the rest of the classes. She never called me out of there. When she came back to get her jacket on at noon, I scared her. Then I got it all over again for not telling her.
And he took my two older siblings to school, and he said to the teacher, "I don't know what I'm going to do with this little one." And she said, "Send her to school." And we had a big pot-bellied stove in the corner of the schoolroom, and she made a bed there for me to sleep in, and I had my own little desk with coloring books, and they were days that our generation could never understand. The generation of today could never understand.
They would spend some time on one side of the room, and you were doing your work while they were instructing that side, and then they would come to this side and teach you. So it was different.
Saddam was another teacher. She boarded with one of the school board's members, and she might have to go. She had to go a couple miles in the morning. They took her to school on bad days in a wagon, and then she had to build a fire in the pot-bellied stove so it would be warm in there when the children arrived. And you sat on benches. You didn't have school desks. You sat on benches. And all the children were in one room from first grade clear up as far as they went. And the older ones would help the younger ones with their lessons. The little ones were absorbing everything that was given to the big ones. So everybody was getting an education. And it was wonderful. Well, my dad says one morning some boys sneaked into the schoolhouse and they sprinkled black pepper onto the stove. And when the teacher built the fire in there, you know what happened. I mean, stinging clouds of making your eyes water. She let everyone else go home early, but the boys that did it had to stay in the schoolhouse.
Totally different than today. Everybody helped each other, and you just looked out for everybody. And there was one thing that I think about so often. There was a lot of old canal people, and especially in the wintertime, you'd sit around the kitchen table at night, around the kerosene light, and they'd tell stories about the canal in olden days. In the summertime, you'd sit out on the porch and talk like that. Oh, we also had the next door neighbor had a she was past 94 when she died, an aunt who loved to tell us stories back from the Civil War, and she remembered the Battle of Gettysburg. She wasn't there, but they could hear the cannons here in Perry County from the fighting there. She was born in 1855, so she was 8 years old when that took place. Yes, we would go out to Paula's grandmother's house, who was my Aunt Bessie, my great Aunt Bessie. She had that organ that had been in her husband's family for the generation before, and she loved to play the organ. And she'd get all the youngie around the organ, and we'd sing for 2 or 3 hours every Friday evening. And we went on Friday because there was no school Saturday. She made us memorize every hymn in the book. I still know them. But she also loved fun songs. I remember one was about Up on the Housetop with Old St. Nick, and I remember helping the great big oak tree there that just came down a little over a year ago. supposed to be over 350 years old. And it had so many leaves on it, they'd come down in the chicken yard, and it would take me all day long, and I was so tired till I got done getting those leaves raked up and carried down to the woods. You knew your neighbors, and you cared about each other. I go to my house in New Buffalo now, I only know about 3 families in town where you just knew everybody, and they were almost like family.
Well, the main hangout was where I worked over at Bosselman's drugstore. I was a soda jerk then, and that's where a lot of my friends hung out at. And at the skating rink, that was the big thing up the road, the roller skating rink. Reams roller skating rink.
We went to the movie theater, which is where the Commissioner's building is now, and we paid, I think, 25 cents for a movie. We would go always on Saturday night, and we'd look forward to what was coming, the coming attractions.
Town, we used to sled ride down the streets in Landisburg, and somebody would stand at the bottom of the hill, watch for a car. Back then, there were hardly any cars coming through Landisburg. And then there was a hill out near where East End Market is now, and we used to there was so many kids, we all went down that hill, sled ride down that hill. And then on the another street we used to go across the road and clear down to a farm that was there.
As kids, we had a field back where we live now that was a ball field. So that was one of the playing, the weekends was playing ball, getting together. We would also, which you cannot do this nowadays for love nor money, play stickball on the road.
My brother had a Lincoln log set. We took the logs out in our driveway. We built houses, we had roads and barns, and then we were introduced to a huge pack of all kinds of farm animals as a Christmas present. So we had bukus of neighbor kids coming in playing on our farm.
I think the kids now are losing a good thing because I don't think they are together and play these games, you know. Of course, I don't know, maybe that's the way they want it, you know, but I do think they're missing out if they aren't together and form a friendship.
The technology is the biggest thing that has hit agriculture. I can remember when I was a kid, we used to pasture cows. I mean, we still do use our pastures, but the intensiveness is greater. The volume of traffic, we'd drive cows up the road and just think nothing of it because there wasn't any traffic. So much, I wouldn't even think about doing that today. The volume of traffic has greatly improved. And something I kind of remember when I was a kid, I thought, hey, a tractor and trailer went by. And I thought, that's really something. Now seems like a dozen go by in an hour's time, and you got to wonder, where are they all going? I would say today the size and scale of the equipment is so greatly improved. The things you see today on farms, and I guess I'm old enough to see that when I graduated from high school, I thought I used to go to the farm show and see huge tractors, huge combines, and I thought, never in Prairie County. Well, I've lived to see that the size and scale is tremendous.
But when Dad picked the eared corn, it went back on an open wagon, and we took it into the corn crib, and you had to shovel it into the crib, or into an elevator, either one, to put it in the crib. And then when it came out of the crib to be ground for cow feed, you had to shovel it back out of the crib again. And nowadays, corn is combined, and it's not even picked as ears anymore, it's shelled. And they just use the kernel into the combine, and then the combine augers it into a big truck, and the truck takes it to a silo and augers it into the silo. It's never touched.
My great uncle Theodore K. Long purchased Bloomfield Academy in 1914. 2 years later, he renamed it Carson Long Institute after his son, William Carson Long, who was killed as a young man in a tragic accident. After World War I, my father came back from the war, and he and my mother in 1919 started working for Carson Long. He became the head of the school in 1921, and he was there for 63 years. I was only there for 50. And basically, it's a college preparatory school for boys. The basic principles were the same. Trying to give boys structure, helping them to get through high school, or helping them to get through college. The word that I heard in 50 years more than anything else from parents was structure. We need structure for our son. Uniforms. They had West Point gray type uniforms, and the faculty members all wore uniforms too, even though only a few of them were actually commissioned in the military. We had a parade every Saturday morning. I'm embarrassed and ashamed and upset that you people didn't see one of our parades on Saturday morning. They made their own beds, they cleaned their own buildings, they policed the grounds, drilled every day. So it was definitely military. The kids were intelligent, but they were lazy. You know, they didn't study. Some of them didn't go to school. They just lacked structure. I have a story that I like to tell. An alumnus wrote back one year and he said, you know, I was failing in 8th grade and my parents sent me to Carson Long. In my first year, and freshman year, they made me study. They made me go to study hall. They made me study for 2.5 hours. And if I didn't have my homework done the next day, they put me in an extra study hall in my free time. So I decided it was a good idea to probably go ahead and study. My sophomore year, my grades started to improve. And my junior year, I was on the honor roll. I'd never been on the honor roll in my life. And my senior year, I wanted to go to college, and he did. So that's really what the purpose of Carson Long was and is. We had a lot of boys from New York and New York City, and of course they came by train. And we'd meet them in Newport Station, and I remember when there was a Newport Station, by bus and take them over to Carson Long. Yes, they probably went to some of the stores, what they weren't supposed to, but that was the name of the game, I guess. We had boys out of the country. We had boys from Russia, from China, from Arabia, Germany, France. Most of them were New York and many of them New York City. It was a melting pot of students. So there was at least one, maybe two faculty families living in the dormitory buildings with the boys 24 hours a day. That was one of the pluses at our school, that they had full-time supervision all the time. And I still think kids need help. Some kids need structure. And I still think there's a place for a military school to give structure, but that seems to be an idea that's fading away.
As far as my childhood, one of my favorite memories is going to Reams roller rink below town. We were in Greenwood, of course. I was probably a 9th or 10th grader. On Friday nights, if there was not a basketball game at school, Friday afternoon before we left, over the announcements, PA system, the principal would announce there'll be a bus behind the auditorium tonight for anybody who wants to go to Reams roller rink skating. Well, we would all pile on the bus to go to Reams roller rink skating. I remember that renting the skates was 50 cents and getting in was 50 cents, so you could roller skate for $1 for the whole night and buy goodies if you wanted to. One of the big things in my childhood was the building of the Millerstown Pool. I mean, we were probably the first community in the county that had a pool. And it was, by the time it was built, it was totally funded. The people of Millerstown actually paid to have that pool sit there. There was no government funding. There were no loans taken out for the pool. The pool was paid for. I remember my mom and dad bought 3 shares. I don't know how much that cost, but they bought 3 shares to the pool. And my friend and I, we would love to find out when Briars was having an anniversary or a special event, because we'd pedal our bikes across the river bridge and go over, you were entitled to all the free ice cream you could eat. Unfortunately, it's not there anymore.
My grandmother, well, she really wasn't stern, I think, but she took charge of everything. And when I say she taught manners, my mother did too, you know. And Mary, my grandmother, and my mother all spoke about 3 or 4 languages, and they would speak German a lot when they didn't want me to know what was going on as a kid. They would sometimes be here for Christmas. All these white tablecloths, the china, good china. Let's see.
Silver.
China, silver. Yeah, silverware was good, and you even had things like the bowl of fruit in the middle of the table, and you had to have the grape scissors. If you had some grapes in a bowl, you'd have to use those to cut a few grapes off a stem, and the scissors would cut and hold them till they hold the grapes they got to your plate. You could not leave the table before you asked to be excused. You didn't interrupt anybody talking. You held your fork and your knife, fork and knife and spoon correctly. And of course the table placing was
And your dad served from the head of the table.
Yeah, and whoever was senior, if it was one of her sons, my grandmother's son, Uncle Bud, Arthur Clare Landis Jr.,
Charles,
or Uncle Charles, they were the 2 sons. They would sit at the head, whoever was the eldest would sit at the head of the table and carve and pass everything around. But at a large table, it'd be cold before you got to eat it sometime.
Neighbors took care of each other. One family in particular had scarlet fever. And of course they were quarantined. And the neighborhood just took food and put it at their door, and now you don't even know who your neighbor is. And people don't neighbor today.
And we neighbored with the Morrows because they were housebound. So Barbara and I would go down and sit with them and just visit, and they were some of the best times of our life, actually. But Mrs. Morrow was a gem. She was like a grandma.
Yeah, Grandma Morrow, she came up all the time to help with our oldest son.
She lived probably 75 yards from our house, very near to Carnes. And she would come up the road, and I can envision her today, and she'd have her checkerboard under her arm. And she and Barbara would play checkers. I was too busy eventually got into the insurance business and was quite busy in those days. But Barbara became quite a checker player, and to this day I suspect she could clean up most people that are
Well, I
involved
haven't
with
played checkers probably since Grandma Morrow died.
Those were the good old days.
I was in 12th grade. We were getting ready to go on the bus when a neighbor from out at my great-grandparents', which was about 3 miles away, out at the mountain, they lived on the farm that he had been born on, and his grandparents lived there since the 1830s, and told us that he had had a stroke. He lived for 43 days. And there was very few hours that there wasn't neighbors there helping. He was paralyzed, and it took help. And Doc Fouts came, and he asked if I wanted to put him in the hospital. I said no. He was born in this house. He wanted to die here, and and we saw to it that he did. But we couldn't have done it ourselves. Later in the day, I was in the store, and a neighbor woman, I often said her mouth was, the only thing that was bigger than her heart was her mouth. But she was really big-hearted. But she said, "What are you doing playing hooky?" And went like that, and I so stern, and I said, "My great-grandpap had a stroke, and I was with him." And she said, "What?" I said, and I repeated it, and she threw her hands up in the air and screamed. She said, "I can't believe it. I never even knew my grandparents." And that really made me think and appreciate what I had.
So my dad was raised on a farm, as were many people in the 1900s. It was a hard life, and my grandmother, Bessie, would work in the fields side by side with her husband, Walter Huggins. He wanted to get an education, so in those days, you went to a one-room schoolhouse. He went to Center School in Watts Township. He walked. It was probably about 2 to 2.5 miles. And so then he finally wound up at the Harrisburg Academy in the city of Harrisburg. And in order to get there, he walked down the hill from his house, probably about a half a mile or so, crossed the Juniata River in his rowboat, boarded a train, and traveled to Harrisburg. So he had enough credits that he was able to teach at Center School for a few years in the 20s. And then he decided to become a Justice of the Peace in 1935. The interesting thing was, when my father passed away, we had a drawer full of watches, because when people couldn't afford his costs, they would of course have to pay a fine paid to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but his costs, oftentimes he would take a camera or a watch. We even had a woolen blanket. So over the years, a lot of times either people forgot or they couldn't afford his cost. So he was so kind-hearted. And he taught a few years, but my dad had issues with his health. And one of the first symptoms he had was with his vision. And finally it was discovered that he had multiple sclerosis. So as a result of having difficulty getting around, he had to give up teaching. I've never quite figured this out, but my parents apparently drove the car together, and I don't know whether he operated the steering wheel and she did the pedals, or it was the other way around. Time went on and my father had to stop teaching, and eventually he became bedfast, paralyzed from the neck down. But the wonderful people of Watts Township continued to elect him as Justice of the Peace. And so the governor of the state allowed him to have a stamp when he could no longer write his signature. At that time, the officers would arrest someone for running a stop sign or speeding or whatever, and they would bring them to our house. So our house was like a courtroom, sort of. And sometimes I was the one that read the violation to them. I don't know if you call it a summons or what exactly you would call it. We had an open door policy. People came in and out, and a lot of times people actually came to him for advice about their jobs and different things. Basically, those 12.5 years, he was paralyzed from the neck down. So my mother had to do everything for him. So I really should probably write a book about my mom.